That thing even legal? The lot attendant at the Buckhorn Travel Plaza leaned against his fuel island booth, coffee cup balanced on his knee, grinning at the rig pulling slow and heavy through the diesel lanes. He said it loud enough for the two drivers fueling on the adjacent island to hear, and they looked up in time to watch the truck roll past them like something that had crawled out of a junkyard and somehow found its way back to the interstate. It was a 1997 Peterbilt 379, and whatever paint job it had once worn was now a memory buried under 27 years of road salt, sun bleach, and patched-over rust. The chrome stacks were pitted and black at the tips. The driver's side mirror housing was held together with a bracket that looked hand-welded. The sleeper cab sat behind the day cab like a hunched old man riding piggyback, its seams darkened with age, the clearance lights across the top flickering in no particular rhythm. The trailer it was pulling, a standard 53-foot dry van, was newer than the tractor by at least a decade, and the mismatch made the whole rig look like a grandfather wearing his grandson's sneakers. The lot attendant shook his head and lowered at the two drivers. "Hope he ain't hauling anything time-sensitive. That Pete looks like it tops out at 45 on a downgrade." One of the drivers, a younger guy in a logoed polo from a mega carrier, laughed and pulled his fuel nozzle free. Probably some old boy running his own authority on a wing and a prayer. FMCSAs go love him when he hits the scale house. The other driver didn't say anything, just watched the Peterbilt ease past the fuel islands and creep toward the back row of the lot, where the overnight trucks were parked nose to tail under a line of busted security lights. The Peterbilt swung wide, wider than, or so it seemed, and then the old truck did something that made the younger drivers stop laughing and just watch. It backed into a spot between two parked rigs with about 18 inches of clearance on either side, and it did it in one motion. No pull-ups, no corrections. The trailer tracked perfectly straight, the tractor tucked in behind it like a dog circling once and lying down, and the air brakes exhaled with a long, tired hiss that settled the whole rig into stillness. The lot attendant blinked. The younger driver looked at his buddy. "Lucky," he muttered, but he didn't sound sure. The door of the Peterbilt opened, and the man stepped down from the cab with the slow, deliberate movement of someone whose knees had filed formal complaints years ago, but whose body still remembered how to move with purpose. He was 63, maybe 65, with a face that looked like it had been carved from a block of mesquite wood and left in the sun to cure. He wore a faded denim jacket over a flannel shirt that had been washed so many times the plaid had become a suggestion rather than a pattern. His boots were Red Wings, resoled at least twice, the leather cracked at the toe boxes, but the laces double-knotted with the precision of a man who believed in doing small things correctly. He stood beside his truck for a moment, looking up at it the way some men look at an old horse, not with pity, but with the kind of respect that comes from knowing exactly how far that animal has carried you and how much it cost both of you to get here. His name was Tomasz Kowalski, and he had been driving trucks for 31 years, though that number itself was a simplification that left out the most important parts. The CB handle he'd used for the last 2 decades was Iron Horse, and it meant nothing to anyone at the Buckhorn Travel Plaza, which was exactly how he preferred it. He walked toward the travel center with that particular gait, not a limp, not a swagger, just a controlled, ground-covering stride that ate up distance without appearing to hurry. His eyes moved in a pattern that no one at a truck stop would recognize, but that anyone who had served in a forward operating base would identify instantly. Scan left, scan right, check 6, assess entry points, locate exits. He did it without thinking, the way most people breathe. The automatic doors opened and he stepped inside, hit by the familiar cocktail of fried food, industrial cleaner, and the faint undercurrent of diesel that followed every trucker inside like a cologne they couldn't wash off. The travel center was busy for a Wednesday night. A cluster of drivers occupied the booths near the subway counter, their conversations a low hum of road complaints and dispatch frustrations. A family with 2 kids was buying snacks near the register, the father looking road-dazed, the mother herding the children with the efficiency of someone who had done this drive before. Tomasz walked past all of them to the coffee station, poured himself a large black from the pot that had been sitting longest. He preferred the thick stuff, the coffee that had given up trying to be good and had settled for being strong, and carried it to the booth farthest from the door, the one with a clear sight line to the parking lot and the entrance both. He sat with his back to the wall. The younger driver from the fuel island came inside a few minutes later, still wearing his mega carrier polo, his lanyard badge bouncing against his chest as he walked. His name tag read, Kyle Pressman, Driver Ambassador, a title that meant the company used him for recruiting videos and social media posts about the trucking lifestyle. Kyle was 29, had been driving for 4 years, and had the particular confidence of someone who had never been tested by anything the road could throw at him that his truck's onboard systems couldn't handle. He spotted Tomasz in the corner booth and nudged his buddy, a driver named Sal, who ran the same lanes for the same carrier. "That's the guy with the museum piece outside," Kyle said, loud enough that 3 other drivers looked up. "Bet you $20 he's running paper logs." Sal, who was older than Kyle by 15 years and smarter by about the same margin, just shrugged. "Man's minding his own business, Kyle." But Kyle was already walking toward the booth, coffee in hand, wearing the grin of someone who thought he was about to provide entertainment for the room. He slid into the booth across from Tomasz without being invited. Tomasz looked up from his coffee. His eyes were gray-blue, the color of highway concrete in early morning light, and they settled on Kyle with an expression that was neither hostile nor welcoming, just present, aware, like a man noting the weather. "That your Pete out there?" Kyle asked. "The, classic?" He said classic the way some people say interesting when they mean something else entirely. Tomasz took a sip of his coffee. "She's mine." His voice was quiet, lightly accented, the consonants carrying a trace of something Eastern European that 31 years of American road life hadn't quite eroded. "How many miles on her?" 2,000,004. Kyle whistled, but it was the kind of whistle that meant that's insane, rather than that's impressive. 2,000,004. Man, at that point you're basically driving a philosophy. That things held together by memories and zip ties. A couple of drivers at the nearest booth chuckled. Tomasz didn't react. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup, hands that were broad and scarred across the knuckles, the fingernails trimmed short and clean despite the grease shadows that lived permanently in the creases of his skin. "What are you hauling?" Kyle pressed, leaning back in the booth with the ease of someone who had no idea he was sitting across from anything other than a tired old man with a tired old truck. Tomasz looked at him for a moment that stretched just long enough to become uncomfortable. "Freight," he said. Kyle laughed. "Yeah, I figured that much. I mean, what kind? Because I'm running 3 loads of pharmaceuticals this week. Temperature controlled, GPS tracked, time critical. My rig's got a satellite uplink and real-time load monitoring. What's your trailer got? A padlock and a prayer." More chuckles from the booth behind them. Sal, standing near the chip aisle, caught Tomasz's eye for a moment and gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head, as if to say, "I'm sorry about him." Tomasz acknowledged it with the faintest movement of his chin, then looked back at Kyle. "You run pharmaceuticals," Tomasz said. Not a question, a confirmation. "I do. High-value, high-security loads. They don't let just anybody run that lane." "No," Tomasz agreed, "they don't." Something in his tone, or maybe it was the complete absence of anything in his tone, made Kyle's grin flicker for just a second. But he recovered. He was good at recovering. It was part of being a driver ambassador. "Look, no disrespect, old-timer. I'm just saying, at some point, the rig tells the story, you know? And that Pete out there, she's telling a story about a guy who should have hung it up about 500,000 miles ago." Tomasz set his coffee down. He looked at Kyle the way a man looks at a locked gate he has no intention of opening. "She tells a story," Tomasz said quietly. "You're right about that." Then he stood, dropped $2 on the table for the coffee he'd barely touched, and walked out. No argument, no defense, just the quiet, controlled exit of a man who had learned a long time ago that some people aren't ready to hear what you have to say, and the road is always waiting. The morning came in gray and cold, a low ceiling of clouds pressing down on the Buckhorn lot like a hand pushing on a bruise. Tomas was up before the sun, or would have been, if the sun had bothered to show itself. He performed his pre-trip inspection the way he performed everything, systematically, thoroughly, and with the kind of attention that turned a routine check into a ritual. He started at the front bumper, a heavy steel unit that was not factory standard and that bore the kind of reinforcement you'd see on a vehicle designed to push through obstacles rather than avoid them. He checked the headlights, the turn signals, the windshield wipers. He walked the driver's side, running his hand along the frame rail, feeling for cracks or loose bolts with his fingertips the way a doctor reads a pulse. He checked the air lines, the glad hands, the electrical connections between tractor and trailer. He thumped each tire with a steel mallet he kept in a custom-mounted bracket on the frame, not the standard rubber thumper most drivers carried, but a machined steel tool that rang each tire like a bell and told him by GDK alone whether the pressure was right. He checked the fifth wheel, the kingpin gay, the landing gear. He opened the trailer doors and looked inside, not at the freight itself, which was sealed and placarded, but at the load bars, the tie-downs, the floor for any signs of shifting. The whole process took 22 minutes. Most drivers did their pre-trip in 8, if they did it at all. Kyle Pressman, who was 3 spots down and just climbing into his cab with a gas station breakfast burrito, watched through his windshield and shook his head. 20 minutes to check a rig that GDK be in a scrapyard, he said to no one in particular, though his Bluetooth headset was live and Sal herded GDK from his own truck 2 spots over. "Let it go, Kyle," Sal said over the headset. "I'm just saying." Tomas pulled out of the Buckhorn lot at 0547, merging onto I-70 westbound with who knew exactly how much torque his engine had and exactly how much his trailer weighed. The Caterpillar 3406E under the hood was not the original engine. He'd rebuilt it himself 11 years ago in a rented bay at a truck shop outside of Terre Haute, Indiana, replacing the turbo, the injectors, and the head gasket with parts he'd sourced from 3 different states and one contact in Manitoba who specialized in engines that the rest of the world had written off. The engine ran clean, it ran quiet, and it produced the kind of low-end torque that modern, electronically limited engines had been programmed to forget. The rig's electrical system had been rewired with a neatness that bordered on obsessive, every connection soldered rather than crimped, every wire run through protective loom, the fuse box organized and labeled in handwriting so small and precise it looked like it had been done with a drafting pen. Under the bunk in the sleeper, bolted to a custom steel plate, was a toolbox that contained equipment you would not find in any trucker supply catalog. A torque wrench calibrated to military specification, a set of metric and standard sockets in a case stamped with nomenclature that abbreviated United States Army, a multimeter that cost more than most drivers' GPS systems, and a sealed plastic case containing a satellite phone that was not available for commercial purchase. None of this was visible from the outside. From the outside, the Peterbilt 379 looked like exactly what Kyle Pressman thought it was. An old truck, driven by an old man, running out the clock on a career that had peaked 2 decades ago. The outside, as Tomas had learned in another life, was the most effective camouflage there was. He made his first fuel stop in Hays, Kansas, at a small independent truck stop that didn't have a loyalty program or a rewards app, but did have diesel that was 6 cents cheaper than the chains, and a mechanic named Stu who had been keeping rigs alive since the Carter administration. Tomas fueled, check his tire pressures with a calibrated gauge rather than the thump test. The thump was for the pre-trip, the gauge was for the stop, and had a short conversation with Stu about a vibration he was tracking in the front axle. "Probably your kingpins," Stu said, wiping his hands on a rag that had long ago surrendered any claim to being clean. "You want me to take a look?" "Not yet," Tomas said. "I'll know by Lyman if it's the pins or the bushings. If it's the pins, I'll pull off in Denver and do them myself." Stu looked at him with the respect that one competent man gives another. "You got the press?" "I've got the press." Stu didn't ask why a truck driver carried a kingpin press in his rig. Some men just carried what they needed, and asking too many questions was a violation of truck stop etiquette that Stu had learned to respect 40 years ago. Tomasz paid cash for his diesel, bought a bottle of water and a can of Vienna sausages from the cooler inside, and was back on the road in 14 minutes. Behind him by approximately 40 miles, Kyle Pressman was running I-70 at 68 miles per hour with his cruise control set and his podcast playing through the cab speakers, telling Sal over Bluetooth about the bonus structure for drivers who maintained a 98% on-time delivery rate. He did not think about the old man in the old Pete. He had already filed Tomasz under the mental category of guys who make the industry look bad and moved on. The convoy appeared just west of Lyman, Colorado, where I-70 begins its long climb toward the Front Range and the sky opens up into the kind of vast, cloud-stacked panorama that makes you understand why people came west and never went back. Tomasz saw them first in his mirrors, a column of vehicles moving in the right lane at a steady, controlled pace that was immediately recognizable to anyone who had ever driven in formation. There were 4 Humvees, 2 M1083 cargo trucks with canvas-covered beds, and the Black Hawk helicopter maintaining position overhead at about 500 feet, its rotors catching the thin afternoon light. The convoy was running with military precision, exact spacing between vehicles, hazard lights synchronized, a lead vehicle with a roof-mounted antenna array that suggested communications equipment far beyond standard issue. Tomasz watched them approach in his mirror. His hands did not tighten on the wheel. His breathing did not change. But something behind his eyes shifted. A light that hadn't been there before. Or maybe a light that had always been there, but had been turned down so low that no one would ever notice it in the dim cab of an old Peterbilt. He maintained his speed. He maintained his lane. The convoy came up behind him, and for a moment it looked like they would simply pass. Another military movement on a public highway. Nothing unusual, happens all the time near Fort Carson and the Colorado bases. The lead Humvee pulled alongside, and then it didn't pass. It matched his speed. Tomasz looked down through his driver's side window at the Humvee's passenger seat, and the soldier sitting there, a sergeant first class, young, hard-jawed, wearing desert pattern ACUs, looked up at him. Their eyes met. The sergeant's expression changed. It was subtle, the way a man's expression changes when he walks into a house he hasn't visited in 20 years and recognizes the smell. The sergeant reached for his radio. What happened next would be talked about at every truck stop between Limon and Denver for the next 6 months, and the story would grow and change in the telling the way all good road stories do, but the core of it would remain true. Because there were 11 civilian witnesses, including Kyle Pressman, who had caught up to the convoy near mile marker 368 and had a dash cam running. The convoy did not pass the Peterbilt. Instead, the lead Humvee accelerated and pulled in front of Tomasz's rig, taking point position. The second Humvee fell in behind the trailer. The 2 remaining Humvees flanked the rig on either side, one in the left lane, one on the shoulder, and the 2 cargo trucks fell in behind, creating a formation that effectively turned Tomasz's battered old Peterbilt into the center of a military escort column. The Black Hawk overhead adjusted its position to directly above the rig. Kyle, who was now 200 yards behind the last cargo truck and unable to pass, watched this happen with his mouth open and his breakfast burrito forgotten in his lap. "Sal," he said into his Bluetooth. "Sal, are you seeing this?" "I'm 4 miles back," Sal said. "Seeing what?" "That old guy, the one from the truck stop. There's a military convoy, and Sal, they're escorting him. They formed up around his rig like he's the president." "What?" "I'm not kidding. There's a helicopter." The convoy held formation for 18 miles. 18 miles of I-70 westbound, the faded red Peterbilt 379 rolling at 62 miles per hour, surrounded by United States Army vehicles, with a Black Hawk overhead and traffic backing up behind them, and people pulling out their phones to record. At the Deer Trail exit, The convoy's lead Humvee activated its right turn signal. The formation began to peel off. Smooth, practiced, every vehicle peeling away in sequence like a military peelback maneuver adapted for highway use. As each vehicle passed Tomasz's cab, the soldiers inside rendered a salute. Not a casual wave, not a nod. A full, crisp, regulation salute directed up through their windows at the man behind the wheel of the oldest, ugliest truck on Interstate 70. The last vehicle in the convoy was the second cargo truck, and as it pulled alongside before peeling off, its passenger, a colonel, full bird, silver eagles catching the light, held up a hand-lettered sign against the window. The sign read, "Iron Horse, 3rd Convoy Support, we remember." Tomasz saw it. He kept both hands on the wheel. GK kept his eyes on the road. GK, this jaw tightened, and the muscles GK worked once hard, as if swallowing something that had been lodged there for a very long time. The convoy peeled off toward Deer Trail, the Black Hawk banking east and climbing, and within 2 minutes, the only evidence that anything had happened was the dash cam footage already being uploaded by 6 different drivers, and the silence on Channel 19. A silence that, on a CB frequency normally crowded with chatter and complaints, was its own kind of salute. Kyle Pressman sat in his cab behind his mega carrier steering wheel with his GPS-tracked, satellite-uplinked, temperature-controlled rig and stared at the back of the Peterbilt Chase trailer as it continued west at 62 miles per hour, unchanged, unhurried, as if nothing had happened at all. For the first time GK years of driving, Kyle had every day nothing to say. Sal's voice came through the Bluetooth, quiet. "You okay, Kyle?" Kyle didn't answer for a long time. When he did, his voice was different, smaller. "Sal, who is that guy?" Sal was quiet for a moment. "I don't know, but I think maybe that's the point." Tomasz Kowalski pulled into the freight yard in Aurora, Colorado at 16:23 Mountain Time, 47 minutes ahead of his delivery window. He backed the trailer into Dock 14 with the same single-motion precision he'd used at the Buckhorn lot, shut down the engine, and sat in his cab for 3 minutes with the silence pressing in a GK. States Army. He hadn't heard that designation spoken aloud in 22 years. He had been a different man then. Sergeant First Class Tomasz Kowalski, lead driver of a convoy element that ran supply routes through territory in Afghanistan that no other unit would touch. Routes that went through mountain passes that made the Eisenhower Tunnel look like a parking garage. Routes where the cargo was classified. The timeline was absolute, and the margin for error was measured in the distance between your front bumper and an IED buried in a road that wasn't on any map. He had driven those routes for 3 tours. He had lost 2 trucks, 4 tires, 1 co-driver, and most of his hearing in his left ear to an RPG that hit the passenger side of his cab on a switchback outside of Jalalabad. He had kept driving. That was the thing nobody understood, the thing no amount of medals or commendations could capture in their dry, official language. He had kept driving. The truck was on fire. Corporal Anaya was unconscious and bleeding in the passenger seat. The convoy behind him was taking fire from the ridgeline, and Tomasz Kowalski had kept his hands on the wheel and driven that burning, shattered truck 4 more kilometers to the forward operating base, because the cargo in his trailer was needed by men who were dying, and stopping was not an option that existed in his understanding of the world. They had given him a silver star for that. He kept it in a coffee can under his bunk, along with Corporal Anaya's dog tags. Maria Anaya had died at Landstuhl 3 days later, and a letter from a general he'd never met thanking him for his service. The coffee can rattled when the truck hit rough road. Sometimes, late at night, alone in a rest area somewhere in Nebraska or Wyoming, he could hear it rattle, and it sounded like everything he'd carried and everything he'd lost. He climbed down from the cab at the Aurora freight yard and did his post-trip inspection with the same methodical care as his pre-trip, because the road behind you deserved the same respect as the road ahead. He was checking his brake adjustment when a truck pulled into the yard and parked 3 docks down. A gleaming new Kenworth W990 with a mega carrier logo on the door and a satellite dome on the roof. Kyle Pressman stepped down from the cab. He stood there for a moment, looking across the yard at the old Peterbilt. And then he did something he had never done before in his 4 years of driving. He walked across a freight yard to another driver's truck, and he stood there, and he waited. Tomasz saw him, but didn't acknowledge him immediately. He finished checking his brakes. He checked his airlines. He walked around to the passenger side and checked the tires. Only when he had completed his inspection, his full inspection, no steps skipped, no corners cut, did he turn and look at Kyle. The young man was standing with his hands in his pockets, his driver ambassador lanyard hanging limp against his chest. And for the first time since Tomasz had met him, Kyle Pressman looked like exactly what he was. A 29-year-old kid who had just discovered that the world contained categories of experience he hadn't known existed. "I owe you an apology," Kyle said. His voice was quiet, stripped of the bravado that had filled it the night before like air in an overinflated tire. Tomasz looked at him. Then he reached into his cab and pulled out a thermos, battered stainless steel, the kind you can drop off a loading dock and it just dents and keeps working. He poured 2 cups of coffee into mismatched mugs, handed one to Kyle, and leaned against the fender of his Peterbilt. "You don't owe me anything," Tomasz said. "But that's what happened on the highway. Who are you?" Tomasz took a sip of his coffee. "I'm a truck driver." Kyle shook his head. "You're more than that." "No," Tomasz said, and there was no false modesty in it, no performance, just the flat statement of a man who had spent 2 decades arriving at a truth that most people never reach. "That's the whole thing. I was a soldier. I drove trucks in places where driving trucks could kill you. And then I came home, and I drove trucks in places where driving trucks could feed you. It's the same thing. It's always been the same thing." He looked at his rig, the pitted chrome, the faded paint, the clearance lights that flickered like old men winking. "She's not pretty. She doesn't need to be. She runs. She carries what needs carrying, and she gets there." He looked at Kyle. "That's all any of us are doing." They stood there in the freight yard in Aurora, Colorado, drinking coffee that was too strong and too hot, and for a little while neither of them said anything, because some things don't need words, and some silences are more honest than any speech. Kyle looked at the old Peterbilt and saw it differently now. Not as a relic, not as a joke, but as a testament. Every dent was a story. Every patch of rust was a year survived. The hand-welded mirror bracket wasn't a failure of maintenance. It was a man who fixed what was broken with his own hands, because that was what you did when you were 1,000 miles from anyone who cared. The reinforced front bumper wasn't paranoia. It was the muscle memory of a man who had driven into hostile territory and needed to know that what was in front of him could take a hit. Kyle felt something shift in his chest. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just the small, grinding adjustment of a man whose understanding of the world had just been recalibrated by about 2,400,000 miles. "Can I ask you something?" Kyle said. "You can ask." "That convoy, how did they know you? How did they recognize you on the highway?" Tomasz was quiet for a moment. "The rig," he said. "I ran military convoys in this truck before I converted her to civilian use. She's got military antenna mounts on the roof. Most people think they're CB antennas. The soldiers knew what they were." He paused. "And my CB handle, Iron Horse. That was my convoy call sign. When I keyed up near Limon to check road conditions, someone in that convoy heard it on the scanner and knew." Kyle looked at the roof of the Peterbilt. There they were, 4 antenna mounts, spaced in a pattern that now clearly looked nothing like standard CB placement. They looked like what they were: the skeleton of a military communications array, stripped of its equipment, but still bolted to the roof of a truck that had crossed oceans in the belly of a cargo plane and been driven through valleys where the only traffic was hostile. "I didn't see them," Kyle said quietly. "No," Tomasz said. "You saw what you expected to see. That's what most people do." He finished his coffee and rinsed the mug with water from a jug he kept in the cab. "You're a good driver, Kyle. Your rig is good. Your technology is good. But the road doesn't care about any of that. The road cares about the man behind the wheel. Whether he'll keep going when everything tells him to stop. Whether he'll check his brakes when he's tired and it's raining and nobody's watching. Whether he respects what he's carrying and where it's going and why it matters. He looked at Kyle with those gray-blue eyes, and there was no judgment in them. Just the patient, steady gaze of a man who had seen the worst the world had to offer, and had responded by spending the rest of his life quietly making sure the shelves stayed stocked and the loads got through. "The truck is just a truck," Thomas said. "It's the driver that makes it something." He shook Kyle's hand, a firm grip, calloused and warm, and climbed back into the cab of his Peterbilt 379. The Caterpillar turned over with a low rumble that vibrated through the frame like a heartbeat, and the old truck pulled out of the freight yard and headed for the on-ramp, pointed west toward the mountains, toward the next load, toward the road that never ended and never asked for anything except that you keep driving. Kyle watched him go. He stood in that freight yard for a long time after the Peterbilt disappeared into the late afternoon traffic on I-70, holding a mug of coffee that had gone cold, feeling the weight of something he couldn't name settling into his bones. It wasn't shame exactly, though shame was part of it. It was more like awakening, the slow, uncomfortable realization that he had been driving for 4 years without ever understanding what driving meant. That night, in his sleeper at a truck stop outside of Grand Junction, Kyle wrote a post on the company's internal driver forum. No photos, no video, no driver ambassador branding. Just a few sentences. Met a driver today. Drove a 97 Pete with 2,000,004 on the clock. I laughed at his rig. Then a military convoy formed up around him on I-70 and saluted him for 18 miles. He's a veteran. He's been carrying loads since before I was born. I don't know everything about driving. I don't know most of it. If you see an old rig on the road, remember there might be a story behind it that you can't read from the outside. Respect the road. Respect the drivers who came before us. He posted it and put his phone down. Through the thin walls of his sleeper, he could hear the sounds of the truck stop at night. The idle of diesels, the hiss of air brakes, the distant murmur of the interstate. Somewhere out there, heading west through the Rockies in a truck that looked like it had nothing left to give but kept giving anyway, an old soldier was driving through the dark, carrying what needed carrying, the road unfurling ahead of him like a promise he had never broken and never would.